sitting duck, ladies and gentlemen. Trust is the issue here, and trust is something that must be earned. No, thank you. To do this, we must multilaterally disarm and involve all countries in this process. Which brings to a close our first argument, and onto our second argument, that the nuclear weapon industry is vital to our economy. Now, you've probably heard from the proposition how scrapping Trident would instantly save billions of pounds that would help to lift us out of recession and aid our recovery. Unfortunately, this is in fact a myth. And Ian Davis of the Security Council actually stated that any savings in the short term of this $2.24 billion would actually be offset by the vast decommissioning costs involved in the process. And abandoning our nuclear weapon programme would also devastate the UK's job market. As I said before, the company that maintains the warheads and Trident employ over 6,500 staff. And in such fragile economic times, can we really afford to shut down West Berkshire's main employer? We say no. The fact is that the UK has just not reached a position where it can completely disarm itself of its nuclear weapons. Now, we do not like nuclear weapons, nor do we promote their use or proliferation, but unilateral disarmament risks the security of future generations and their ability to pay for it. Which brings to a close our second argument, that the nuclear weapon industry is vital to our economy. Now soon you will hear from my partner Bethan, who will go on to explain how unilaterally disarming risks the security of our citizens and the status of Britain. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, we would not abandon the UK's nuclear weapon programme because acting alone is globally irresponsible, economically irresponsible, and risks the security of our citizens. Thank you.
Our second speaker for the proposition from Aberdeen's Boys School is Hassan Ginger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the review conference for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2000, the UK signed an unequivocal undertaking to accomplish the total elimination of our nuclear arsenals, leading to full nuclear disarmament. We believe that it's our duty to maintain that commitment, and we believe that honouring that commitment is also in our interest. Ed's shown you already why nuclear weapons don't offer us any strategic value in today's world. In my speech, I'm going to make two further points. Firstly, I'm going to show you why keeping and renewing our nuclear weapons programme actively undermines the cause of global disarmament. Secondly, I'm going to show you why possessing nuclear weapons actually poses us more of a threat than it does a form of insurance. First, let's look at what we've just heard. And there are only two rather small points of rebuttal to Ed's speech. The first point was this: under the NPT, you're allowed to respond in proportional circumstances. Well, the first thing we say to this is that there are lots of other commitments under the NPT, like the one I've just mentioned, that Britain isn't signing up to. The second thing we say is that law and general thinking about this has thus far reached the conclusion that there would be no such proportional threat ever likely to emerge unless you yourself were struck by a nuclear missile. Now, we gave you a lot of examples and analysis of why we don't think we'd ever get to that stage, and why, indeed, even if we did, the logic of having a nuclear weapon doesn't suffice. What we say is that there are lots of ways of stopping countries developing nuclear weapons. No, thank you. For example, engaging with them diplomatically, even using conventional weapons if necessary to take out their capability of using nuclear weapons. Then we heard, well, it's too big a risk for rogue states to ever, we might or we might not. But we're not just making this point conjecturally. We've given you examples. We've given you the example of Israel and how all the groups around it don't think it's too big a risk. We've given you examples of the Falkland Islands and our allies Kuwait. Each of those times, the leaders and actors in those cases realised that we wouldn't do it, and the evidence suggests that they will indeed take the risk. Then we heard 2 points. Firstly, we heard that unilateral disarmament was by definition irresponsible, and that all disarmament had to be multilateral. That's the way of making progress. We think that if you think we have made significant progress so far, that's simply naive. So far, our Trident capabilities are that we have 148 warheads, a third of which are on patrol at all times, just one of which has 8 times the killing power of the bombs that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We don't think that's progress that we should be proud of, ladies and gentlemen. We don't think we're willing to simply wait for decades more while countries like Iran, which the Speaker herself identified, use the kind of rhetoric that we embody because we have nuclear weapons and they apparently aren't allowed to have them, to actually get more nuclear weapons and opt out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as I'll explain. No thank you. Then we heard, well, they are indeed independent because we have a plant in West Berkshire. I'll explain why they're not. The computer systems depend on updates from America. We buy off-the-shelf components from America that expire every few months or so. Most of the people in the servicing stations, for example, at the base around here on the Clyde, and many of those people are actually American personnel. We can go on and on. The targeting system is American, but we just can't function these without regular servicing, for example, in the state of Georgia. I could go on and on. They're simply not independent. Then we heard they're vital to the economy. Firstly, we never claimed that they'd lift us out of the deficit or anything like that. But what we do say is that the £76 billion in the long term is fairly evidently much greater than the £2.1 billion lost in the short term, which is the normal running cost anyway. And furthermore, on the point of the industry, we say there are plenty of other things those people could do with those skills. One of the things that reports have identified that they could do is, for example, decommission ex-Soviet missiles. There's a lot of demand for that, and they have the skills to do that. So now, let me now look at this first point about renewing our nuclear arsenal and how that undermines the cause of disarmament. Here's what we've agreed to do. We've agreed under the NPT in 1968 that we could have nuclear weapons on the condition that we gave them up. It was on that condition that the rest of the world allowed us to get away with that deal, that we take early action to disarm. We say that if we renew Trident, if we carry on, we cheat those other countries and we cheat that bargain. But why is the NPT so important? We say it's created really strong international pressure for states not to proliferate nuclear weapons. For example, it created pressure on countries like Ukraine after the dissolution, I'll take you in one moment, of the Soviet Union to hand over their nuclear weapons and join the NPT. It's created pressure for countries like Iran to stay in the treaty within which they can be closely monitored. And it's created pressure for other countries to stay in, within which they are unable to receive the sort of expertise they might develop a weapon. Yes?
I think we already established that the Non-Proliferation Treaty is clearly working and it obviously has some way to go, but we've already established that it's a good thing. This isn't a debate about whether the Non-Proliferation Treaty should exist or not.
So here's why what we're going to do is we're going to undermine it. A few reasons. Firstly, we undermine the principle, the grand bargain at the heart of the NPT. The idea that we have nuclear weapons, but we promise to get rid of them. If that becomes no longer credible, then every other country in the world can look at the UK and say, they're not obeying the rules and getting away with it. Why on earth should we? The pressure for them to stay in totally dissolves. Secondly, it normalises the belief generally in the international community that the kind of thing self-respecting nations need to have in order to uplift their standing in the world is nuclear weapons. We don't think that's the kind of thing you want to tell them. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to be a leader in disarmament. We want to give other countries the impetus, as they have failed to have politically at home, to actually engage in nuclear disarmament unilaterally if needs be, in order to secure world
On point of information.
No, you're out of time. So secondly, why does having nuclear weapons pose more of a security risk than a form of protection? Well, actually, it's very simple. It's because of the nature of the kind of groups that Ed identified in his speech as posing the most threat to us. Groups like terrorist groups acting out of failed states. These groups are often built upon a narrative that states like the UK are hypocritical, are imperialist, are dominant. We think that renewing Trident, in spite of such obligation, is exactly the sort of signal that says we don't care about the international community, we think we have a right to something that you don't. We think that not only allows them to garner more support, it gives them a target, us, along with other countries who in fact are actually making more efforts to disarm. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that's something that also applies to the state. If we look at Iran, as I mentioned earlier, we think that rhetoric, allowing them to point to our country and point to the double standards there, allows them to get away with increasing proliferation. We think that's tremendously damaging.